Good afternoon and welcome to the Outdoor Recreation Council of BC's November webinar. My name is Ryan Stewart. I just started sharing my screen there. Today's webinar is the Indigenous Protected and Conserved Areas is the topic. And I'll start with a little housekeeping. So first, I want to acknowledge that I am grateful to live, work, and play on the ancestral and unceded territory of the Comox First Nation. In the spirit of reconciliation, we are making a donation to Salmon Parks. We'll be learning lots about this project over the next hour. Feel free to put your pencils down. We're recording this webinar and we'll be sharing a recording with you later this week, along with key takeaways, action items, and links to resources. We'll start with a presentation by our two guests, followed by a question and answer session. We'll wrap things up around 2 p.m. Pacific time. If you have questions during the webinar, please click the Q&A button on your screen there, and you can tap it right in there. Someone might be able to answer them directly during the presentations. Otherwise, I'll do my best to pose them to our guests during the Q&A session. I apologize in advance if I don't get to everyone's question. Immediately following the webinar is a super short survey. Please stick around and take it. It helps us do a better job of these webinars and cover the topics that you want to learn about. Today's webinar was made possible by the generous financial support of the Real Estate Foundation of BC. It's part of a regular series of webinars hosted by the Outdoor Recreation Council. The ORCBC is the only unified voice for the outdoor recreation community in British Columbia. We represent about 100 nonprofit organizations and more than 100,000 British Columbians, everyone from anglers and dirt bikers to bird watchers and rock climbers. In general, we advocate for recreation on a provincial level. We work to improve legislation and policies, stakeholder collaboration, education and training, and funding. As a nonprofit ourselves, we rely on outside funding sources, including donations from people like you. We just launched our primary annual fundraising campaign with a goal of raising $10,000 by December 31st. If every person who registered for one of our webinars over the last year gave $5, we would hit our fundraising goal. All donations are tax deductible and eligible for a tax receipt. And there's going to be I think a donation link in the chat here in a few minutes. All right, so let's get on to today's webinar. Indigenous Protected and Conserved Areas is a newish term for an idea that's been around for at least 30 years. Also known as tribal parks, or by its initials, IPCAs are a catch-all term for the general idea of an Indigenous-led land and water planning and management process. As you can see from this map up here from this David Suzuki Foundation report, there are already about 8 IPCA type protected areas in the province, kind of spread all over there. You can see there are at least a dozen more proposed for British Columbia by First Nations right across the province again. Exactly how these new proposals will turn into parks and what those protected areas will look like is going to vary dramatically, and there isn't really a set process just yet. And that's created a bit of an uncertainty, anxiety, and a little bit of misinformation. We hope today's webinar will bring at least a little bit of clarity to this important topic. We've got 2 people with us today who have firsthand experience with the IPCA process in British Columbia. Byron Spinks is a Lytton First Nation councillor and an elder leading the Stein Nahatlatch Indigenous Protected and Conserved Area Initiative. He's also an ORCBC board member. The Stein Nahatlatch Initiative would develop a comprehensive land and water use plan for a large area of the Eastern Coast Range. Eric Angel is the GM for the Salmon Parks Stewardship Society. It's a registered nonprofit set up by the Muchalaht First Nation to implement their vision for taking care of their chiefly territories, which includes portions of the watersheds and waters of Nooka Sound on the west coast of Vancouver Island. Okay, with that, I'm going to stop sharing and I'm going to hand the mic over to Byron. Byron, let's get started. Why don't you tell us a little bit more about the Stein Nahatlatch initiative and where it came from?
Thank you, Ryan. First of all, I'd like to introduce myself formally, and my traditional name is Nihan, which means good-natured guy, man. So it's very sort of leading path that my elders have trained me since the early 60s and to today. So, but I've always been involved with community led initiatives in my area, in Lytton First Nation in particular, and as well as other nations in the territory. And so I'm very well, my passion right now is to try and develop land protection and conservation areas within our territory, which is leads me to the IPCA that we're talking about, the Stein Nahatlatch. It's a big initiative. We're in the council community engagement process right now. It's very interesting because of the interest I've received from the elders, particularly, and so that has led me to believe that we should start from the real leadership of the nation, the elders leadership, and then work with the elected leadership that we have in place at this time. But the Stein Nahatlatch initiative encompasses 1.5 million hectares in the Fraser Canyon and Thompson River areas from Spuzzum, which is south, so just north of Yale, and right up to Lowit, and then cross over to Lowit or Ashcroft. And it's all on the west side of the river. And that's the area that we've looked at particularly. My elders have always guided me through this process, and they said they wanted to start big. We know we'll never realize that amount of territory to be designated as an IPCA, but that's our goal. And over the next 3 years, I think we'll probably have more IPCAs developed within the nation. Ideally, we'd like to have one IPCA, but I don't think that's realistic at this time. But if we can have at least 4 or 5 IPCAs developed, we'd be very happy to have the same common, have the same vision, incorporating our traditional values and leadership that we have in place at this time. So it's a challenging process. We're looking at our IPCA has two provincial parks in place already, the Stein River Heritage Park and the Nahatlatch Park. So those are areas that are already protected, but we'd like to be an asset to those parks, provide some more resources to them through training, and also ideally having a good management plan for each park that would fit within the overall nation plan. So those are areas that we'll be working on in the future, but that's the vision we have. It's a very interesting process that we've encountered since 2019. It began as a small idea, but now the idea is getting bigger and more relevant and more appropriate because of climate change. And with this atmospheric rivers that we've encountered, the floods, everything's leading us to bring us to a point where we realize that we have to protect and conserve our land more better than we have in the past. So with the Indigenous-led process, incorporating our traditional values, I think this is a good road to follow. It's an area that has never been incorporated before. We've all the Indigenous nations or bands within our nation have tried their best, and I think they did a good job as well as they can individually. But I think if we develop a comprehensive approach to land management and conservation protection in our area, we'd be more successful. I've been involved with this since 2019 as a volunteer and as an elder. We have 2 streams happening at the same time. We're trying to develop an IPCA, but at the same time, we like to develop and promote nationhood through the leadership of the elders. So that's all I have to say at this time. It's the IPCAs are becoming more popular nowadays. As I see, there are about a dozen IPCAs being developed already. We have one IPC already formed within our nation. The Kanakavar Indian Band have developed an IPCA, and they're doing a good job. And I'm always promoting their process, and they're working closely with us and how we develop ours on a bigger scale. So thank you very much for this. I'm open to more questions, more specific questions. I'll try and answer that. Thank you.
Thank you, Byron. I appreciate that. Eric, can you tell us a little bit about the salmon parks?
Sure thing. So I'm just going to share my screen, and I've got a few slides here. Talk over those. So I am the general manager for the Salmon Parks Stewardship Society. As Ryan said, we were set up by the Muchalaht First Nation to implement the vision that the nation has for protection within the hahuułi, which is the chiefly territories. Just starting with our core guiding principles within the Muchalaht territory. ISAC is, I'm at a conference right now on IPCAs, and one of the speakers from Muchalaht First Nation, Joe Martin, who's a very well-known carver, he spoke of ISAC as the first law of Muchalaht peoples. It's the importance of having respect, the responsibility to have respect for oneself and for others. And then we have the concept of uu-a-thluk, which is similar to what you would call stewardship. It's the responsibility to take care and of yourself and of the world around you. And then hishukish sawak, which means that everything is connected and everything is one. So our vision for salmon parks, first of all, is, there's an ecological component. We're protecting key salmon watersheds. In words of Tai Hutwith, our head chief, Mike McQuinna, we want to let nature take its course, because too often we think that humans can fix everything and that we have nothing to learn from nature. But our philosophy is that we have everything to learn from nature, and we should listen to nature to understand how to help the healing processes. And we do that on a watershed scale within MFN territory. The second big goal here is to secure the establishment of salmon parks through recognition by federal and provincial governments. And so one thing that's important to understand, there's different paths here that nations follow, but in our case, the chiefs identified these salmon parks back in 2016. They issued a declaration 2 years ago, and we're now seeking recognition from the federal and provincial governments, because we want to strengthen the legal protections for our salmon parks so that they can enjoy through challenges that may come from others, and so that they have it's a well-woven blanket that we're creating here. The last thing is that we're developing the supporting governance and management system very much based on the Muchalaht laws, and I'll say a little bit more about that. So here's a map just to orient everyone to where these parks are located, and MFN territory as a whole. It's the west side of Vancouver Island. You see Strathcona Provincial Park on the right, so it's a very large area there. That a good portion of that is within MFN traditional territory. The non-Indigenous communities, Gold River and Tassis, those are the two main ones. The salmon parks are the numbered areas. So these are upper watersheds generally of salmon systems. So Tassis, the Canooma River, which is very important for the hatchery at the base there, which produces a lot of Chinook that drive our recreational fisheries and commercial fisheries and Indigenous fisheries. Muchalaht and Gold River, very important. Steelhead, Sockeye rivers, which have been quite affected by climate change and by forestry. So then we have the Burman, which is still an intact watershed, a really beautiful valley bottom old growth area, a huge cultural and fish values there. And then on Nook Island, two areas there as well that we're trying to protect. So those are you can think of these as one big protected area or as a series of separate ones. There are other areas within MFN territory that we're also seeking to protect. But when we refer to salmon parks, these are the areas that we're talking about. It's about 67,000 hectares in total, not including the water, fresh water within them. Overall, MFN territory is about 370,000 hectares. So it's a substantial portion of the territory. So here's the declaration I referred to, came out last year, signed by the MMFN Council of Chiefs. MMFN uses a hereditary system. So these are not band councils that are elected through the Indian Act. They're hereditary leaders that are chosen, that the nation, represent the nation. So 5 chiefs there. They represent the different houses within the nation. And this declaration was issued in the English language, but we're currently working with our elders to redo it in Muchalaht, and when the time comes, we will have a feast and invite folks from all around to witness the declaration in the Muchalaht language and done properly with the right cultural practices. So how are we establishing this? This is a very abbreviated version of what we're up to, but our beginning is we're creating a foundation in the Muchalaht and MFN law. So we're working with an organization called West Coast Environmental Law, and they use a methodology that was developed by the University of Victoria Aboriginal Law Unit, which called RELAW, Revitalizing Indigenous Law for Earth, Air, Land, and Water. And so basically we work with stories and songs that the community holds to document and then revitalize the laws that we need to be able to do our work properly. So that's really the foundation for everything. Alongside that, we're building our own internal capacity because we started from scratch. We had no capacity to start with really to do this kind of work. So we're hiring within the community, training people, bringing on everyone from, administrative staff to guardians to technicians to planners and so on. We work very closely with a community advisory group. We have 12 people in that group, elders, youth, fishers, forestry workers, and they advise us. They meet several times a month. We bring an agenda to them, and they provide much of the day-to-day direction for how we operate as a stewardship society on their behalf. We do a huge amount of collaboration with outside partners. We have about a dozen different NGOs and government partners that we work very closely with. We get all sorts of kinds of support. Sometimes it's direct, funding support. Other times it might be someone will help us create a map that we need. That map you saw was created by the Wilderness Committee for us. And trail building is something that we've talked to a number of partners about that, we're certainly looking at getting support from NGOs to do that. And then the last and not the least stage of what we're trying to do here is we have to negotiate with governments. I already explained how we're seeking governments. We want them to recognize as the salmon parks as existing under an Muchalaht law, so that we can have legal systems working together to support what we're doing. So we have negotiating tables with the province, with Ministry of Forests and the Waterlands Resource Stewardship, with the Parks Canada, with Environment Climate Change Canada, and so on. So that takes up a lot of time. It's a lot of meetings, a lot of background kind of technical work. What kind of activities can happen in salmon parks? I'm sure people are curious about this. The first one is restoration. So that might be thinning secondary forests that have been planted with a single species, trying to diversify species, bring it something closer to what old growth forests look like, so that over time those secondary forests will evolve back into old growth primary type forests. Cultural practices the community has in there, so harvesting medicines and traditional root gardens, berry picking, hunting, and so on. Small scale harvesting, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous, of forest products and fish and wildlife. Recreation, which is particularly your interest, and then research and education. We collaborate with academic institutions and youth and the schools to try and bring people out onto the land and learn about the ecosystems that we're looking to protect, about MFN culture and stories. And so just briefly how people can help and contribute. The first thing I'd suggest is you learn what you can about the nations and the IPCAs in your territory. Reach out if you have, people within those nations and you can learn from them. Reach out and let them know that you're interested in learning. It's very important to show respect, ISAC at all times, and that will go a long ways towards establishing those right relations. And then you follow protocols, because within Indigenous communities, those protocols between nations and between governments and between individuals, those are really fundamental. And so as we establish salmon parks, we're also establishing protocols to govern how we interact with our neighbors and with governments and so on. So if you're working with nations and they have protocols, you ask about them and then you follow them, that will go also a long ways towards establishing a good relationship between you and the nations that are bringing about these IPCAs. So that's it for me. So I'll just stop sharing my screen. And yeah, thanks.
Excellent. I'll just start just before we dive into the full-on Q&A. Maybe you can both touch just briefly, give us kind of a bit more of a sense of how, for instance, Eric, with salmon parks, how will things fundamentally change when it comes to, say, recreation in those 6 sort of areas that you're looking at protecting. What would be different if you achieve the Salmon Park objectives of full kind of recognition from the provincial and federal government?
Well, there would be management plans that would be co-developed between governments and MMFN and Salmon Parks. So those management plans would be jointly developed, and there would be First Nations guardians. You know, ideally, we have First Nations guardians that are there to enforce both MMFN and provincial laws. That is happening in some parts of BC. Kitasoo, Hehe, and Nuhawk have that kind of an agreement with the province, but you know, those take a lot of work and they'll take a while to establish. But definitely the guardians on the land from MMFN, and then there'll be much more opportunity to work with the nations around developing recreational opportunities. So tourism is a really important piece for MMFN. And I forgot to mention that, you know, on the last slide there were some websites you can check out. One of them, Explore Nuka, is our tourism website. So I think really this will expand the possibilities for tourism opportunities within the nation, and Salmon Parks definitely, we would love to be developing tourism opportunities there. So yeah.
All right. And Byron, you know, for the Stein Nahatlatch initiative, what's sort of the vision there of what it would look like, a relationship with recreation?
I think it's a joint partnership or relationship we would like to develop with our neighbors and within our territory and our governing bodies to develop that management plan, as Eric was saying. A comprehensive plan is needed at this time because there never has been one in our territory. So that's one of the main goals that we have within the Fraser Canyon area and Merritt area. And it's just getting people together with the leadership, under the leadership of the elders. I think that's a new aspect of our new management plan. We'd like to bring their perspective in, their knowledge to guide the process. And as Eric was saying, it's a long process. We can't achieve it overnight. So we're just taking step by step in the Stein Nahatlatch area. And it's, you know, it is time consuming, but it's worth it to take that time to ensure that all people fully understand the process, especially with our neighbors. You know, we're here to be inclusive with the management plan, and the restoration is required for many areas of our territory. It's we can't do it alone, and we realize that we need to develop partnerships with all levels of government in order to for them to support our vision also. So, you know, the capacity building is so important at this time, and we're trying to encourage that at the local community level to develop the capacity for the needs of our guardians, our land guardians, our biologists, you know, the scientific portion of our plan that we'd like to be part of.
All right. And the other question I think on a lot of people's minds when it comes to this is a lot of people think of IPCAs as being synonymous with the provincial park or a national park. You know, you mentioned some small scale harvesting opportunities, Eric, specifically. I mean, Byron, maybe start with you. Just how will recreation fit into this? How will it look like? Will it look like provincial parks, or is there going to be different aspects, different areas?
I think the parks will remain the same. I mean, the boundaries will remain the same, but they'll be part of a greater, broader scope of protection, and the values and the management plan that will have to be integrated together with the existing management boards for those parks with the province of BC. And I think it's a win-win situation. We're not trying to compete with the parks, but we'd like to enhance and be a positive portion of developing that management plan that they would need, just as we do on the other areas of the nation. So it's going to be a win-win situation, I think, for everybody.
All right. Eric, did you have anything to add there?
Yeah, I think just that there will be a difference from provincial parks in the sense that the relationship that the Muchalaht have with territories is always one of use, right? Like it's not that these areas are just set aside, blocked off, and no one is allowed on them. So it's very much it's a relationship where people will be out on the land use and interacting, right? So I think you'll probably see something that is less about a philosophy of protecting something that never gets touched, but rather respecting and making proper use of and learning from. So it's just, I think it's going to be a different relationship that way. And then the other technical kind of thing to understand is that there are no, if we're using provincial designations to create these parks, there aren't any designations out there that really work in the way that First Nations want them to in all respects. The closest that you've got is something like the Conservancy, which was set up for the Great Bear Rainforest. And that's what the hahuułi and tlok'wit nations recently announced in their territory. But, you know, and we may end up going the Conservancy route with salmon parks. We may go something else. We may create a new kind of designation, right? So it's going to look somewhat like parks, but it's also going to be different as well. And a lot of this is in the process of just being created too.
Yeah.
More uncertainty, sorry. Less.
Yeah. No, I think that's fair. I think, you know, one of the questions we have here, and maybe that's an interesting way to tackle it is, do you anticipate restricting or reducing or increasing maybe access to any of these areas when it comes to the public, the non-First Nations public related to that area?
I think from my perspective, we'll be enhancing the participation of people coming into our territories through education, and being present on the land. I think it's so important at this time to share our values that we have to the land and how we respect it. And I'm hoping that this will become a natural process, not you know, by inviting people to come in, but we'll have a natural presence on the land at all times, and that's one of the goals that we have in our nation.
Yeah, I think from our end, access, it's going to be different again. So in some cases, there'll be more access because we want to build trails. There's old trail networks, like there's a very well-known within the Muchalaht and Kwakwaka'wakw communities. There's a well-known grease trail from Tassus up to Wass Lake and then over into the Nimkish Valley. And I've just been chatting with some of my friends from Nimkish territory here about reestablishing that grease trail as a regular route that people can follow. It's very historic. It's got a lot of cultural significance. So in some respects, access is definitely going to increase for people. In other respects, some areas are going to be more restricted because they're sacred sites. They're areas that we don't want people coming into and overwhelming. There may be areas where we're trying to do some important work to repair habitats that have really been degraded. In those areas, you'll see restrictions. I mean, that's no different from, you know, parks where you've got an ecologically sensitive zone. So the answer is it'll change, but it'll be a transparent process too, right? Like it's not just going to be something that comes down all of a sudden, areas are blocked off, you can't go there. There's going to be a long and intensive process to work with people around how these changes happen.
Funding, I guess two aspects of that. Are you getting any support from the federal and provincial government when it comes to sort of the 20 by 30 biodiversity and conservation and protection sort of goals that we have? And then the other aspect is, will there be user fees implemented to help offset costs in the future?
For funding for our initiative there's no government funding at this time. It's all funded by foundations that would like to support us during this process. Initially, I guess eventually we will be, if we are designated as an IPCA, we would receive some funding from the federal government, but probably not as much to sustain the initiative on a long-term basis. So we're looking at other sources for funding for the sustainability. But you know, we haven't come to that point yet, so we're just developing the foundation for the initiative right now. So that's where we're in the next couple of years, we probably need to develop our declarations and having the community support and nation support behind it.
And so, just to be clear, Byron, at this point, it's all coming from the nation itself and then these outside funding sources that are supporting you? Yes.
There's no government funding. We're not competing with any other initiatives. We're just at this time we're that's the only source we can access at this time. But there are opportunities out there that we'll be seeking in the future.
Okay. And then do you anticipate, as part of
Mm.
the recreation access to those areas in the future being user fees to that?
I can't speak to that. I'm not sure what's going to happen, but I don't. In my vision, I don't see that happening.
Okay. And Eric?
Yeah, funding's a huge piece of what we're working on right now. And we did get a very substantial grant from Environment Climate Change Canada under their, all these acronyms, Nature Smart Climate Solutions Fund. We got $15 million from them. The vast majority of that goes to pay for the forestry tenures that are on there. So that's the most expensive piece in setting up salmon parks, is that there's existing forestry tenures that are in the tens of millions of dollars in terms of value, and we have to find a way to compensate the tenure holders in order to be able to convert the land to a protected area status. So that money from ECCC is an important chunk of that, and then we're raising the rest of it through foundations and private provincial government sources. Our operational funding is otherwise is all non-government and comes from a bunch of different NGOs and partners. And we haven't done any public fundraising yet. We're going to do that for sure. We want to tie it closely to initiatives that like the trail building I mentioned, because then it's easier for people to see what the results are of what they're doing. And there's a lot of good models to follow. The tribal parks in tlok territory, they have a tribal park allies fee that is finally starting to really bring in some substantial revenue from them. It's paying for their gardening programs. It's great stuff. Kitasoo have developed some excellent relations with businesses operating in their territory and have really positive relationships. So there's a lot of great examples around the province that, for sure.
All right. We have a question here from Kira from 4VI, which is formerly Tourism Vancouver Island, wondering about how tourism can talk about IPCAs and where they, what kind of language they should be using and for sharing with visitors. I think it's something that a lot of recreation groups are wondering too, if there's how to talk about these things. And do you guys have any suggestions or direction for people when they're looking to communicate some of this information to their group or their stakeholders?
I think the education part is very important initially for them to understand what IPCAs are and how they're formed. It may be different from nation to nation and territory to territory. So it'll be up to individuals to find out the right connection to make. My IPCA will be far different from the coastal IPCAs because of their environmental challenges and opportunities. So I would say just do the research and develop relationships with the tribal groups that you're working with.
Yeah, it's a great question and an important one. I think the first thing is to just, contact directly the nations, in your territory that you're interested in talking about. That's always the starting point. But if I'm suddenly inundated with a bunch of requests for advice on that, I'm going, because we got a lot of plates. So I think you've kind of identified I'm thinking about this as the questions are coming in, that maybe what we can do is kind of an FAQ or something on our website with some suggestions for language use, and then we could point people to that. So yeah, it's a good question, and we'll give some thought to how we can help folks communicate what we're doing in a way that works for everyone. It's a good idea.
And another question I've seen a couple times now is, asking how people can be an ally for these processes. So what are some things that I know you've both touched on them a little bit, but maybe just lay that out really clearly. Where should someone start if they want to be an ally, if they want to show support? What are some things that we can do?
I think it depends on what you're looking for. We're pretty diverse in our territory. Our nation is very diverse, and opportunities for developing an ally relationship from fisheries to forestry to tourism. We're not in our case, we're not organized to a point where we have an organization per se. We're a group of people that are meeting on a regular basis to have this vision for the future, but we'll certainly incorporate the windows of opportunity for allies to come in to share their vision also with us. So that's, you know, it's a long process, as Eric was saying, for same with us, and it's just a matter of developing that network you need to meet your needs.
Mhm. Yeah, for us, I mean, it depends. If you're living within the territory, then just like I was saying earlier, learning more about the nation and the work it's doing, and you know, we're just getting organized. So eventually, I anticipate us having opportunities for people to come out and help with work that we're doing in the restoration work for sure. We're just not there yet, but I think that'll be an opportunity. And likewise, we haven't set up any kind of public fundraising, but that's, you know, that will be coming down the road. So that's another way. If you're a business, I think there's lots of opportunities there. It's going to take time to build those relationships of trust and reciprocity within the territory, where businesses can contribute and feel like they're getting something back from contributing to what we're doing, and vice versa. So again, I've seen that happen in many places. So if you're a business and you want to support, then just start a conversation. Really, it's where else do you start?
Is there, you know, maybe beyond you two being obvious contacts for with your particular projects, but outside that, who's sort of the person that is kind of a first contact for someone attempting to get involved with one of the other IPCAs that's going on in the province?
Yeah, I think the Outdoor Recreation Council BC have done some really good work in the reconciliation process, and they have a handbook out as a guide that could be used. And it's very well written and well explained. And I think we can start from that process and build as you go along. And because it's going to be different in each area, and we have to recognize that. So we have to build on what we have existing and work with it.
Yeah. So if you're looking to who to contact, I mean, start with the nation's website, and who's the band, you know, call up their Lands and Resources Department and ask them about it. If you're interested in more general about IPCAs, the conference I'm at is organized by something called Isaac Olam Foundation. So they've done a lot of work on IPCAs, and you can learn quite a bit from their website. And but there's just some legwork you got to do if you want to speak to someone. It's just caution against. There's no one size fits all here, and it really is about talking to the people in where you live who are involved. And yeah, you just got to reach out and go into the band office, ask to speak to someone.
You know, touching on that normal, there's no, you know, one size fits all. There's no formal process established yet by the provincial government of how they're going to kind of work through this process of recognizing these IPCAs. Maybe you can just touch a little bit on that. I mean, what has been you know, when you talk to the provincial government partners about your proposals, what is their sort of reaction or their direction that they're giving you, and how do you see this playing out as we continue down this path over the next 5, say, years?
Go ahead, Byron.
I'll wait for you.
Yeah. Dude, I can say a few things first. Then
Yeah.
So yeah, so we're involved in a couple different processes with the province. One of them with Ministry of Forest is a forest landscape planning process, and they've got those in different places around the province. That one's quite formalized. It's got what government folks call a mandate, which means there's a decision at the level of cabinet that says, you know, you have authority to go out and do this thing called forest landscape planning. And so there's a lot of comfort within the department or the Ministry of Forests around engaging in this process. There's defined results and all that kind of stuff. Walrus, they don't have anything like that. Sorry, Walrus is Waterlands Resource Stewardship. So, and they're the folks that we deal with for salmon parks primarily. They're a new ministry. They're still forming up in terms of how they're going to operate and so on. So my suspicion, and I can't speak authoritatively about it, but my suspicion from chatting with other folks who are working with Walrus on their own initiatives from other nations is that each situation's a bit different, depends a lot on your counterpart in government, who you're working with. If they're a real champion, if there's somebody who wants to get stuff done, they'll find a way to get it done. But if they're a little unsure of themselves within that bureaucracy, then it's not going to move that quickly. And so you can, interestingly enough, you can often make more progress through an existing government process like the FLP one, because they're confident in, government officials are confident in acting. With Walrus, I think we're still waiting to see how effective they can be as a ministry in terms of getting us to where we want to get to. We have some clear objectives that we presented government with, and now we're just starting to get down into the weeds with them, and it's sorry to be vague about this, but it really is from the government side.
Same on my part. I wear many hats in my nation, and I'm just trying to figure out how to answer that question. I have different relationships with all of the government as an individual elder, and I don't represent, when I meet with the government, I'm not a official representative of Lytton First Nation or a tribal council per se. I always introduce myself as an elder first, and this is what our vision and goals are. We're not an organized body yet per se, as a nonprofit society or non-government organization. So it's, but we do keep our representatives formed, our MLAs, and if we have a particular ministry we'd like to contact, we make the effort to inform them of who we are, and we'd like to meet with them on a one-to-one basis in the future. And that's a process that's time-consuming, but necessary, I think, for them to understand where we're coming from. And in our territory, we have 2 MLAs that impact our nation, so we have to be conscious of their responsibilities also, and how we can encourage them to be more active with us as Indigenous people.
All right. I have a few questions here kind of relating to how IPCAs might impact parks or tree lands, things like that, depending on what is already existing there, tenure holders and things like that. So do you have a sense of how you'll work with tenure holders, if they are, say, recreation related tenure holders, with overlaps there? Or if it's a provincial park, do you see that guardianship mandate sort of overlapping and taking over those parks?
I don't think we'll be taking over the parks in our area. We like to work with them more closely. We've already had inquiries from tourist operators in our territory, and how can they be a part of the positive movement from their perspective as tourist operators. And tenure holders eventually will be contacted for tenures. It's all part of land planning, land use planning, and we have to get it all parted together to have input, and hopefully the values of our nation will be the guiding light for those efforts that we put forward.
What about at Salmon Parks there, Eric?
Yeah. When we designed the boundaries, we like, for instance, with Wass Lake, we set the boundary of the Salmon Park right below that, or the one by Muchalaht Lake, the provincial park there. That doesn't fall within the Salmon Park. Now there are some others that are in there, but for the most part, we've tried to, and we haven't included any of Strathcona in there. We haven't actually come up with a long-term vision around how we're going to work with parks like Strathcona Park that might that are within MFN territory. So it's a good question, but I don't have an answer for it. In jurisdictions, I mean, we were asked about, I don't know if this is really the question, but I'll answer it, and on the assumption that it is. So when we presented to the village at Tassus 6 months ago, one of the questions that came up from folks in the community is, okay, how's this going to affect my private property, my tenure? And the answer is, it's not. We're not. This has no impact on fee simple lands at all, right? So, and we're not disrupting. If there are tenures, like resource use tenures, that we need to remove in order to protect and conserve the area, then we're negotiating with those tenure holders to compensate them for those, for for the interest they have in it, so that we can then move ahead with it. But otherwise, we would work with existing tenure holders. Like if there's somebody who has a tenure for some kind of recreational activity within there, we'd work with them just like we do with a referrals process right now. And we have a referrals process within our nation when folks want to come in and conduct a tourist operation or a lodge or something, they bring it to our chief and council. So same thing there.
We have a question here about that all IPCAs are self-declared. So can you touch on what that means and where that process now goes? I know we've sort of touched on parts of this, but just to be clear, I think. Go ahead, Byron.
I think initially our declaration will identify the areas that we have jurisdiction and responsibility for. We'll be working alongside with other nations that border our territory, and we'll be liaising with them at the same time as we're progressing to provide updates. And I believe that we've already begun that process with them, and some of our neighbor nations are also thinking of developing IPCAs, the same as what we're doing. So it's going to be a joint relationship all around, I think. Just one of those things that we have to be aware of. And every nation, geographic boundaries are different. There's always a common bond of use that we have with other nations. And I think we just have to clarify and agree to those common bonds we have.
Yeah, self-declared just means that it's the nation that declares that it's not something that a government identifies. In terms of what can be done to support government to move forward with it, I mean, there's discussions within Walrus around potential legislation, IPCA legislation. There's mixed feelings about that amongst First Nations, because sometimes legislation can actually be more of a pain than a benefit. It just depends how well it's done. But we do work closely with the policy folks in government to try and encourage them to think about legislation in certain ways. And the trick here, and the thing that makes it really difficult for governments and they struggle with, is that nations are, as the individual rights holders, are rightly insistent that the government come to them directly to negotiate any kind of agreement that affects their territories. And so each nation is different. And so it's hard to write legislation. Well, I don't know that it's hard, but you don't see many examples of legislation that can accommodate that diversity at a very local level while still having some general principles. I'm not a lawyer. I'm not saying it's necessarily really that hard to do, but in talking with government, it's something that they bring up over and over. How do we do something that is based on certain kinds of principles that are common across the board, but yet respect the individual nation rights holders? That's, if they can solve that one, then I think we're going to move along much more is currently the case.
Yeah. So that ambiguity kind of makes it every single one needs to be custom designed and built and figured out, where if we had some kind of framework, like you were saying, if it fit within this type of conservation zone or whatever it was, then it would be a little bit easier to move through them quickly versus this slow customized process for each one. Is that generally what you're saying there? Yeah,
basically. Yeah. I'm just noticing follow-up in the chat window too about the concern is around the legality of declarations. So if I can just address that, so from our perspective, these tenures exist under Muchalaht law, or sorry, these salmon parks exist under Muchalaht law. They were declared in a manner that is very much in keeping with how Muchalaht law operates. But the Muchalaht law isn't yet recognized under colonial legal systems. So the question is, recognition of law can happen in a couple of ways. You can have a piece of legislation from the government that says, we hereby recognize Indigenous law and things that are created using that law. And you can have that kind of reciprocal legislation, but you can also have the reality on the ground of recognizing it, which comes out of just really deep work building the respect and the relationships on the ground. So if we work really closely with the municipal governments in our area, we closely with recreational fishing lodges and tourism operators and companies, and they all acknowledge MFN authority within the territories, and they all pay some kind of fee that helps contribute to the greater good of how these lands are managed and so on. You have that legal recognition that you essentially need, right? Like it's what the academics call de facto versus de jure. De jure means it's written down, it's in the law. De facto means it's the fact on the ground. And my feeling is just my personal prejudice around this is I'm not going to waste tons of time getting obsessed with the de jure stuff, right? Like that can take decades. I don't know where it's going to go, but we're trying to create the reality of recognition on the ground. And if we can get that, then I'm not that worried about the de jure stuff. But just our perspective on it.
Byron, does that fit with the Stein Nahatlatch initiative, kind of where you guys want to get to as well?
Yes, that's exactly. Yeah, so we're working towards the same thing. You know, it's slow process, and again, we've been saying that over and over again. You know, it's not going to happen overnight. It takes time, and to develop that respect and mutual cooperation, we need at all levels, from the tenure holders to government and to individual landowners. It's you know, it's better done, you know, locally, and once people want to come and reside in our territory, that's when the education process we'd like to share with them and our values. Yeah.
This is taking a bit of a step back to the very beginning, but you know, someone's asking here about you know, what was used to sort of identify where, you say, the salmon parks or the Stein Nahatlatch initiative, like the areas that you wanted to protect. How did you sort of make those determinations of these are the areas that we deem that we want to be in control
of? From our perspective, when I consulted with the elders of our nation, we wanted to look at an area that was least impacted by industry, and we already had a couple of provincial parks established. So we identified an area, study area, that we wanted to work towards, which is what I mentioned earlier, 1.5 million hectares. We never achieved that, but that's a vision that we had, and you know, we can accomplish 75% of it, we'll be very happy. And I think that's a realistic goal right now. So it's you know, the area that we just said, this is the area in our territory that we'd like to protect and have more input. And through that, just those discussions, other IPCAs have also been developed in other parts of our nation that have their very sensitive areas that need protection also. So those have been identified, and through the leadership of the elders and direction provided to band councils and chiefs. So it's an ongoing process.
And does it kind of factor back to those sort of areas that you've identified as maybe culturally important or particularly in need of protection? Are those sort of the driving forces for you?
Well, it's culturally important because the wildlife in our territory has been very impacted, and when you look at the spotted owl, and the grizzly bear, those are two important species that we like to protect and at a great scale. A lot of good work is being done right now as we speak, and to try and protect them. But I think if we have a more comprehensive approach to it, we'll be more successful. But you know, with things like that help us drive in designating certain areas for protection.
Yeah. And Eric, with the salmon parks, what was sort of the parameters that helped identify those areas?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and similar to Byron, we worked with elders to identify areas that were particularly important for salmon. We were looking for areas that still had substantial amounts of intact old growth forest, and also watersheds that were really well watered. So one of the key kind of dynamics that our former lands manager and biologist, Roger Dunlop, identified is that there's certain areas within Muchalaht territory where, when there's been previous episodes of heating or warming within the climate, that people and fish retreat back to these watersheds that are really well watered. They get a lot of snowpack at elevation, and they've got a lot of deep groundwater supplying the streams so they stay colder, so the fish can stay there longer. So they're basically functioning like climate refugia. And so the areas that we identified are a mix of these different factors. They're culturally important. There's still lots of old growth ecosystems which are critical for salmon habitat. They're really well watered. There's still important fish production streams like or rivers like the Burman. Yeah, but and they're accessible to us. Like we're not dealing with so many different other uses that it makes it logistically really challenging to even go after them there. So.
Is that why you didn't necessarily go for some of those lower sections of some of those watersheds that you were looking at?
Yeah, they've been heavily logged and they're harder. There's very little old growth left in those. So I mean, it's still very important to do restoration there. And the eventual goal of the nation is to be changing how forestry is done across the territory, right? Like one thing I didn't mention before, it's really important to understand with the vision here is that we're not making this big split between, on the one hand, you got conservation, everything's looked after, and on the other hand, it's business as usual, just log the heck out of it and don't worry about it. It's not like that. We're trying to do better across the full landscape. So even outside salmon parks, we're going to be changing how forestry is done on the landscape in a way that, because everything is connected, right? So what's happening outside of these watersheds is still impacting them. And what we do within our watersheds impacts our neighbors as well. So we have to be thinking of things.
Yeah, and so those would be safe through a forest landscape planning process or other government processes that you can sort of dictate how those practices are done.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
A question here from Greg Hamilton asking you to describe the governance at the end state, i.e. after the IPCA is up and running, who is making the decisions?
From our perspective, the Lytton territory, we're working on a model right now that would incorporate the existing local governments, the band councils, and establishing a larger group that would have responsibility of overseeing the bigger picture, as opposed to small stamps that band councils are given on reserve lands. So it's going to be different. We're not quite sure it's going to be as a nonprofit society governed by a board of directors, or it's all wide open at this time. So, but there is it's something that will be unique to our nation.
Okay.
Yeah, we'll be setting up co-management boards, and so it'll be a combination of government and nation technical staff and managers, and there'll be opportunities for outside stakeholders to participate in it as well. And it's one thing I didn't mention here is like the community processes are really important for us, and we are going to eventually start formally engaging with all the stakeholders in our territory, and there's going to be opportunities to participate in the management as well, because we really want this to be a collective.
Yeah, I think that'll hearten a lot of people to hear how inclusive and transparent you both have been talking about this process being. I think that's part of that misinformation and anxiety aspect of the whole IPCA process, of it being so vague, is this idea of all the people that love the land and being out on it, being kind of shut out from it. So it's definitely, I think, heartening to hear that. We're coming right up at 2 o'clock here, so I think I'll end the Q&A session with maybe just one more question for you both to sort of just weigh on. Our audience always likes action items, so what is the one thing you would say for someone in the recreation community that cares about this issue? What should they do? What is the one thing they should do when this webinar is over? Go ahead, Byron.
I think just being in contact with local governments, band councils. They have staff that are appointed or delegated to certain things in land management and so forth. Being in connection with those people, I think it's very important to develop that positive relationship, so that if you have any concerns or if they have any concerns, they would have somebody to talk to. So don't be afraid and don't be shy. And it's I'm sure that you'd be welcome with open arms to have coffee or tea with them.
It's great. Yeah, I mean, ditto to that for sure. And the only other thing I'd say is just let people know that you're in support of it, that you're not, you know, that you're not frightened, that this is something good that's going to be good for nature, for British Columbians, and that, you know, there's some pushback out there against Indigenous folks leading conservation initiatives in their area, and you know, we got lots of work to do to let everyone know how this is really going to work well for everybody. Add your voice to that.
All right, I am just going to quickly share my screen and wrap things up here. Thank you both so much for sharing your knowledge, your experience, your perspective. I really appreciate it. I also want to thank the Real Estate Foundation of BC for helping support today's webinar. And thanks for everyone in the audience for joining us. The webinar is part of a regular series. The next one will be in January. And the best way to stay up to date on the webinar topics and everything else the Outdoor Recreation Council of BC is doing is by signing up for their newsletter on their website, orcbc.ca. And a reminder that we'll be sending a recording of this webinar along with key takeaways and links and resources this week. And to please stick around for the survey. It will load as soon as I stop talking. So thanks again, Eric and Byron, and everyone have a great afternoon.
Okay.
True.